Thank you very much. Um, okay, so the title of this presentation is "How to Maximize Informed Consent: A Data Linkage," looking at the effects of placement, context, and order of consent questions. And this is with my co-authors Annette, Mick Cooper from Michigan, and Elena, who's also at the University of Essex. Um, so, although the title of this conference is asking respondents to do more than answer survey questions, most of what I'm actually going to talk about in this presentation is asking about survey questions. Although these are survey questions that are different to the sort of standard survey questions that we carry in the survey, some survey questions have implications beyond just answering. So rather than you just ask a question, the respondent answers it, you can see the interviewer marks something down in their laptop and continues. When we're asking for consent to link to administrative data, to send a blood sample kit, then we're actually asking the participant to sort of buy into more than just answering a question. So although it is a survey question, it leads to actions beyond the survey. And there could be potential risks to the participant in agreeing to consent to admin data linkage or having a blood kit sent to them, which aren't there for standard survey questions. And the risks tend to be to the participant, whereas most of the benefits are to the study itself. So it's an uneven exchange. And this makes the idea of informed consent particularly important. So with informed consent, it's important that the participant understands what they're being asked to do, why they're being asked to do it, and then what happens if they agree. What will the actual process be? What are the benefits, the risks of agreeing, how the data are managed? So all of this needs to be conveyed to the participant so they are then able to give or withhold their informed consent. So that means the questions have to be more detailed than standard survey questions, or they have to link to additional information, or interviewers might hand over information leaflets. So even just answering the survey question is actually more work for participants. Although in a questionnaire it just looks like a survey question, the participants have to give a lot more effort and thought behind answering it. I'm going to talk about the Understanding Society COVID-19 study. So Dan talked a bit about this earlier, and just some basic information about the first wave started in late April 2020. We had a pre-notification letter, which we sent to all active adult sample members, telling them that this was coming up. People were invited by email, by SMS. There were also email and SMS reminders. It was a 20-minute survey, and the principal part of the COVID-19 study was a web-only survey, and very different to our normal study because we only had a 7-day fieldwork period. So we really wanted people to come on, answer the survey quickly, and so it was a very limited fieldwork period. And we had about a 42% response rate in that first interview. But one of the key points of this was it was a very fast turnaround. So the questionnaire consultation, specification, scripting, testing, fieldwork, data release all happened a lot quicker on our normal survey. And so the data was actually released in late May. And then, as I said, the spine of the COVID-19 study was the web survey, and we had 9 waves of the web interviews. We also had a couple of telephone interviews in May and November for people who hadn't taken part in the initial survey and who weren't in a household where people use the web. There were 3 youth questionnaires. But then the one I want to focus on is the March 2021, which was the 8th wave of the COVID-19 study. And this included a request to allow us to send the participants a blood kit so they could send back a sample of their blood. But we also asked for permission to link to NHS data, and that included things like hospital care records, primary care records, the sorts of prescriptions they were on, if they had COVID-19 tests. We asked separately for permission to link to NHS registry data. So that's just information about cancer registrations, death registrations. And if people said yes to this, then Fieldwork Agency would give us that information about people who consent, and then we would send that information on to the NHS data holders, and we would have to send things like the name and address and date of birth to the NHS who hold the data, who could then make that linkage. But we also asked for permission to send a serology kit. So as I said earlier, this was the equipment needed to take a small blood sample and then return it to a lab. And if they agreed to that, Ipsos Mori sent the kit. No participant details were sent to the lab, and the participant would then have to take the blood sample in their own home and send it off back to the lab. So we did some experiments with these consent questions. We experimented with the position in the questionnaire where these consent questions came up. So it was either early, so after the initial household relationships module, which was about 1.7 minutes into the interview. We also wanted to test early in context. I'll talk about that a bit later. So that was about 4 minutes into the survey, where we had just asked everyone about coronavirus and vaccinations. And then late in the questionnaire, so almost at the end, after the general health questionnaire, so it's about 20 minutes into this survey. And then we also experimented with the order of requests, whether or not we were going to ask about the health set first, the NHS data and the register, and then ask about serology, or ask for the serology, the blood sample first, and then the health data linkages. The first thing to note was that consent rates were relatively high. I said this was a web-only survey with just a 1-week fieldwork period, and the consent rates were high, sort of 80% for serology, around 70% for NHS register, and 6 out of 10 people gave consent to all 3. So the research questions I'm going to cover are: is there a higher consent rate when the question is asked early? Does the order affect that consent rate? Does the effect of the consent position depend on the order? So is there an interaction between these two? Then are consent rates higher when the request for data linkage appears more salient? This is something we touched on a bit earlier. So the first one, is there a higher consent rate when the question is asked early? Some earlier research we'd done, colleagues at ISA found that an early request was more successful than later. This had been confounded because the earlier request was also in context. Joe Sackshaw and some of his co-authors have found again that asking earlier is better than asking later. The work that we had done on a Nuffield-funded study on consent found that earlier consent was more effective than asking later if the wording was difficult, but there was less of an effect if the wording was made easier. And we found that consent rates were higher when we asked early rather than late. So the blue bars there are where we asked early, and the green bars where we asked late, and these are all significantly different to each other, and so higher consent rates when asked early. Then we looked at the order, whether or not the order affected the consent rate. There has been some analysis which shows that, you get a higher consent if you, for the first one that you asked. And we'd also done some analysis into this, and if we found that if the first consent question you ask for is for a domain that generally gets high consent rates, if they're sensitive, then there is a carry-on effect, and you do get higher consent rates in following questions, but then we weren't able to replicate that finding. We found in this case the order of the consent questions did not matter. So whether or not you ask the health care first or the serology first, it had no difference on the consent rate. And then looking at the interaction of those, we found that the effect of the consent position did not depend on the order of the consent question. So whichever one you asked first, it didn't make a statistically significant difference. And then we looked at whether or not they'd be higher when the request appears more salient. So we thought perhaps if you just ask them a set of questions about the coronavirus vaccination and their experience with this, then if you ask them about linking to health data, or if you're asking them to allow us to send them a blood sample kit, they may be more likely because the request is now in context and it seems more salient, it seems more obvious. If you just been asked a set of questions about health, and then you have a health request, people might be more likely to take that up. So we're comparing this early group, about 1.7 minutes into the interview, with the early in context, which is slightly later, but only by a couple of minutes. And from research I mentioned earlier, we found that consent rate was higher when asked in context, but that context point also took place early in the survey compared to the control group, which was at the end. So we couldn't disentangle these two effects. We found that when asking early is less effective to ask in context. So both of these requests were relatively early in the interview, but when you ask them in context, the consent rate was actually lower, which is not what we were expecting. And these are significantly different. So for these research questions, is there a higher consent rate than questions asked early? Yes, we did find that. It was not affected by the order that we asked them in, and the effect of the consent position didn't depend on the order of the consent questions. And not only are consent rates not higher when the request for data linkage appears more salient, it was actually the opposite. We found that they were lower. So we started looking into why the position of the consent question affects consent rates. So when people said no to any of these consent requests, we did ask why, and there was a set of decoded responses and then another category. And these responses were based on qualitative research that we'd done with Kelsey Benninger and her colleagues back in 2017. And from those qualitative interviews, several sort of ideas came up. People said, often it's too personal, or I've shared enough information with the survey. And we sort of call this giving fatigue. They've already answered a lot of questions, and this is yet another bit of information you want from me. There's also some ideas around risk-taking fatigue, where people might have been unclear about the risks involved, or they don't quite understand what would be done, and so saying yes would be a bit of a risk. And then there's cognitive fatigue. So people might just get too tired, or they've been asked a lot of questions. They don't want to make another decision. They don't have the mental energy to think through all of the reasons for and against consenting, and so it's just easier to say no. And we randomized those reasons, so they weren't always in the same order. We found that giving fatigue was the most common reason for non-consenters. And again, just to highlight, the reasons were randomized, so this wasn't a primacy or recency effect. And the graph here shows the reasons for not giving consent for the NHS data, and it's a very similar pattern for the NHS register. Risk and cognitive fatigue were less likely, but they were always more likely to be mentioned when the request was late in the survey. The people who were asked for their consents late in the survey, they were always more likely to give reasons of giving fatigue, risk, or cognitive fatigue. There's a slightly different pattern for serology. So it's a lower proportion saying giving fatigue, but then I guess this was a very different type of request. We were just asking if we could send them a blood kit. And there's a higher risk fatigue when asked in context. So that's the blue bar there, than in other positions. And that was the only significant difference with serology, is those who were asked, can we send you a kit so you can measure your blood, for serology to see if you've had any COVID antibodies, people are more likely to say a risk fatigue reason when they were asked there in context rather than in any of the other places. But we didn't find evidence of any actual rather than perceived cognitive fatigue. So we did have a set of 4 true or false statements about the consent process. And there was no difference between the number of correct responses by position. There's no evidence here of of people just being too tired to read the information, or at least they weren't as tired early on as late. There's no difference between them. So we're thinking that for data linkage consent, when asking late in the interview, there is a perception that the participant feels that they've already given us enough information, and so why do they need to link the data? There are small numbers who might feel that the risk is too high. Perhaps they're worried that we're checking up on what they've told us. They're too tired to think it through. And then for serology, really the only thing that we found was after asking a set of questions about the vaccine, asking about serology seemed to increase perceptions of risk. The work that we're doing at the moment is looking more into why people agree to some but not other requests. So for the 3 requests that we asked about, we found the majority of people agreed to all 3. About 12% refused all 3, so they were at least consistent. Then about 22% agreed to one type, so they agreed to, for example, the data linkage, but not the other, was serology, or vice versa. And then it was just around 5% had a mix between the types, so they're sort of inconsistent. So that's work that we're still doing. We found that there was a strong correlation between consenting to the NHS and register linkage, and then a weak correlation between either of those and serology. And so it seems to be clear that people are thinking of these requests as different types. And I think that's true, because obviously they are. So for the data linkage request, it's just a questionnaire response. There's no other action. They don't need to do anything else. It all takes place sort of in the office. But for the serology request, once they give their questionnaire response, there are some follow-up actions which involve them directly. So they receive the kit, and then they have to take the blood sample, they have to return the kit. So this could be seen as either a very high-cost request, because we're actually requiring action from the participant, specifically action that requires piercing yourself and drawing actual blood. Or it could also be considered as a low-cost request, because the only thing they're agreeing to do is to have the kit sent to them, and they can then postpone the decision on whether or not they're actually going to give the blood sample at a later point. So when it comes to asking for consent, we find that asking it early does seem to have a positive effect, and that seems to be consistent. And perhaps maybe not asking it after a set of questions which may provide similar information. And also, it might not make much of a difference in the end. So this is a proportion of people who return the kit of all participants. So whether or not they consented to having the kit sent to them, just all those people in the early in context and late groups who did return a kit. And there's no difference between those who were asked early or those who were asked late, whether or not they agreed, whether or not they returned a blood sample. The only difference was that those who were asked early and in context were less likely to provide a blood sample than those who were asked early. So a lot of this work on consent draws on other projects that we've been running at ISA. So there's one called Understanding and Improving Data Linkage Consent in Surveys, and we have a project page here. And there's also been quite a series of Understanding Society working papers looking at consent, and they're all available on the Understanding Society website. So I will finish there and be happy to answer any questions.